Hello, Ryan. How are you? So what do I have to do? Oh, okay. So back in, I guess, well, Adolphe Sax was born in 1814, and he was one of 11 children. His father turned to instrument making, manufacturing, and made loads of cool stuff like serpents, flutes, violas, and clarinets and brass instruments. And Adolphe Sax, his childhood, like they should make a film out of it. He was known as the ghost child because he was massively accident prone, like fall out of windows and swallowed poison. What else? He fell in a river at one point. Um, but I think he was a remarkable force when you sort of look at what he achieved in his life. I suppose he's most famous for inventing the saxophone, but he did a huge amount of work improving the bass clarinet when he was just in his 20s. And he there's a book called The Devil's Horn. So if anybody is interested in making a film, they should read it. It's really, really fantastic. And when was it invented? Well, we don't really know. We know it was patented in 1856, but around about 1838, there was sort of more signs of things were going on, like handwritten recollections and stuff. A friend of Adolphe Sax, Henry Hamel, I think you pronounce it, wrote about the creation of it around about 1838, which is a lot earlier than we think. What happened next? I suppose then, a bit later on, there was this massive industrial exhibition in Belgium. And I think Adolphe Sax, I don't know, it's just how it is in my memory. I think he went along to this exhibition ready to unveil this amazing new saxophone. And he had it all wrapped up in a cloth, especially waiting to have it unveiled. But I think there was a lot of jealousy about him because he was, I get the idea, he was a kind of young upstart, kind of getting his way onto the inventing scene. And somebody got really hacked off with it and kicked the saxophone over and made it totally unplayable. And that was about 1841. So I suppose, and then I could go on and on, but I'll spare you. But I suppose the conception that most people have about the saxophone is it's kind of I don't know, like a 20th century jazz instrument. And it's really, really not. It really was not invented to play jazz and rock. It does that brilliantly because it's a brilliant instrument. But it was an instrument that Sax wanted to create to basically replace the woodwind bass section, like bassoons and ophicleide. He hated the bassoon. There's a brilliant, let me find this quote. He's so rude. Yeah, I found it. So he's talking about wind instruments in general and that the sonority is a bit either too harsh or too weak. So he says the ophicleide produces a sound so disagreeable that it must be kept out of resonant halls because of its inability to be played softly. And then he says about the bassoon. The bassoon, on the contrary, has such a weak sound that it can only be used for accompanying and filling parts, yet for specific forte effects in orchestration, it's utterly useless. I love that. Been really obnoxious about the bassoon, and he wanted something powerful with a really massive sound to replace that lower end of the wind section. But then at the same time, it's kind of a multifaceted beginning because he invented a set in C and a set in F that was for the orchestra. And so there's a piece by Strauss, the Sinfonia Domestica, that was originally for C and F, and Bolero was originally for C and F. But then the B and E flat kind of took off. And I think that's because, and again, I don't know, but I think that's because the marching bands, the military bands, would use the saxophones because it's an instrument that can play really loud outside, but not just be a kind of brass instrument. And I suppose saxophones, sometimes people think they don't believe you that it's woodwind, and you just have to sort of look at them and go, yes, I have heard of Charlie Parker, thank you very much. But it is a woodwind instrument, but it has this sort of metal amplification, so it can really sort of play well outside. I suppose one interesting thing, because I suppose jazz was evolving at about the same time, so late 1800s, I guess, like Sidney Bechet, I guess, is an early jazz player of the saxophone. And then 1920s, jazz really took off in America, and I think it traveled through the south of France, up through France, and got to Europe that way, I think. And so maybe it's a coincidence that saxophone and jazz seem to go so hand in hand. And I think another reason it goes so hand in hand is that it seems to me like jazz musicians, it's all about, not in a critical way, about ego. You know, it's like you think of Coleman Hawkins or you think of Ben Webster and you think of them and their sound. When you look back at classical, whatever that means, saxophonists, it's more about what they brought to the repertoire, possibly. So one of the first big commissioners of saxophone music was this woman called Elise Hall, and she was a wealthy American lady connected with the Boston kind of pops orchestra. I can't remember its real name. And she commissioned loads and loads of really quite like Debussy. She got Debussy to write her a piece, and he was really, I think he might have been a little of a low spell, maybe the old opium, I don't know, but he took a commission, I think, and then kind of started dilly-dallying around, not quite writing something. I don't think he liked the saxophone, or at the time, the way maybe it was early instruments didn't sound quite as they do now, but he called it sort of aquatic kind of instrument, and he referred to Elise Hall as an old bat with an umbrella, because she was a kind of shortish, kind of wealthy lady with big frocks, and probably not brilliant at the saxophone. So a lot of these pieces, they are quite beautiful. There's one by Dondi called Chant Sacré, I think it's called, which is truly, truly beautiful, but it's about 4 notes. So I guess a bit like Chet Baker as a trumpet player who didn't seem to have much of a range, like high to low, maybe like an octave, but what he created was really, really beautiful. So I think it's lovely to have these 4 pieces. And then other early kind of grandfathers of the saxophone. There are lots and lots of women. In fact, the first recording of saxophone and Edison cylinders was by a woman called Betty Monkland, which is kind of cool. But then we had Adolphe Sax was the first teacher at Paris Conservatoire. After him, it was Marcel Mule. You could talk about Marcel Mule for about 4 hours. But he lived for 100 years and ran a saxophone quartet for ages, maybe like 40 years, I don't know. But anyone who's been in a saxophone quartet knows that's basically impossible. So he deserves medals for that. Marcel Mule took over from Adolphe Sax at the Paris Conservatoire, and I think nearly every classical saxophonist, whatever that is, they all link back to either him or this other guy called Sigurd Rascher. And I think we think of Adolphe Sax as the grandfather of the saxophone, and he was a real teacher and a real musician and a kind of freelancing musician almost. You know, he'd play in jazz bands. In fact, he'd hear the vibrato on jazz clarinets and stuff, and maybe even saxophones, and wondered why didn't the saxophone use vibrato? Because up until kind of Marcel Mule, it was played really straight like a big gold clarinet. Yeah, he was a real kind of jobbing musician, I think. And then Sigurd Rascher he's like a pioneer. He was really like committed to Adolphe Sax's invention and the fact that it was an instrument that could play for octaves and octaves and octaves. Again, a bit like a clarinet plays outside of its range, I think, more comfortably or more regularly than maybe the saxophone, although that's changing. So I think the parameters of what we do on the instrument technically seems to be stretching and stretching all the time. Like when I was a student, it was rare to find students that could do circular breathing and all the sort of party tricks like that. Whereas now it seems kind of like bread and butter that you just have to be able to do it, which is fine because it's not the hard bit about saxophone. And there are so many incredible technicians, especially in Europe. And the way we approach music, I think, is different on different continents. And then the saxophone in England, I think, is a curious thing because it's hard to earn a living being a classical saxophonist, because I kind of hope that I am one, but Crystal Palace, Park Road there. Yeah, but to actually earn a living getting up and playing music, I think it's really, really difficult to do just playing classical saxophone music. So a lot of English players, we kind of, I think, dip a toe in other fields. So students often learn jazz and clarinet and flute and piccolo and all of that. And I think I've probably earned more money playing the piccolo than the saxophone, but I'm like really, really bad, you know? And I wonder if that happens around the world. I don't know. Modern repertoire. I think there's some real kind of champions of writing for the saxophone. So I think Turnage writes beautifully for the saxophone. I've started playing with this series called Illuminate, and there's all these female composers that wrote for the saxophone that I hadn't really looked into much. And there's a piece by Hilary Tan for saxophone and orchestral piano reduction called what's it called? It's in the first spinning place. And that's really beautiful. For me, jazz is a bit terrifying because there's no limit. You just keep going up and up and up. And I find that a bit overwhelming, a bit like having 3 years of tax return. Why bother starting? Because you're never going to get to the end. So, but with classical saxophone, I think it's a brilliant way of, or I suppose classical music, or you're in the middle and you're decoding what a composer's written to then give to a listener. And so the light's not shone on the performer, in my mind, quite so much. But I guess that ties us back to performance and contemporary classical saxophone. Like in the UK, everyone likes a personality as a performer, like the Young Musician of the Year. And whereas I think competitions, certainly on the continent, when I've gone and marked them, it's more like a sport of like numbers and adding up and judging across a board. And I'm really not a big fan of competitions at all. But when it comes to kind of performance things, I think in England we like big personalities, and the saxophone suits itself really well to that. Again, like we were saying about jazz players and how sound is such a big thing. And I think English musicians, we like to listen and think about sound, and maybe not do this like pop on like I am now about the thought behind it all. It's more kind of let's just get on with it and make good music, I think, is what I admire about other English musicians and try and learn from them. I must have done 10 minutes now.
You have. Perfect. Woo-hoo! Thank you.
Oh my God, that was really stressful. Right, okay.
That's in, by the way. Okay. Let me ask you a couple of questions, Naomi.
Yeah.
One of the things I was kind of thinking about is whenever I'm a composer. Whenever I studied an instrument, the violin or the cello or whatever instrument, the teacher would point to examples of pieces that were great masterpieces. So with the violin, it would be Bach's sonatas. Do you want to think about where to begin writing for a violin? Look at Bach's sonatas or Berio Sequenza or whatever. One of the things I'm curious about is it feels like there isn't such a thing for the saxophone, and I'm curious for you as a performer. You're kind of in this world where people aren't really they don't have a starting point with the saxophone, and I'm curious what you would say to composers about your instrument to give them an idea of where to start.
Well, I suppose in regard to the repertoire, it's all kind of tipped on its head. So we have these really, really fantastic pieces by like Denisov, Ibert, and then pieces by Debussy that it's not really his best effort, it doesn't seem. So we have pieces by famous composers that aren't necessarily that brilliant, and then we have these really fantastic pieces that by composers people maybe haven't heard as much about. And one of the very best pieces that was written for bassoon but works great on two baritone saxophone is a duo sonata by Sofia Gubaidulina. Like that's so brilliant on saxophone, like full stop, the best piece for two saxophones. And then there's the Berio Sequenzas, which obviously if you're looking at that kind of extended technique world, there's one for alto, but then the one that I believe for, was it clarinet originally? Clarinet, I think. Yeah, that works great on soprano saxophone. So I would say to composers, know that it's a chameleon-like instrument. Know that it has limitations, so talk to the performer. And basically, I think it's an instrument that we always try and make really, really sing. So write something singing. That's not a particularly helpful answer, is it? But there we are.
I didn't know you played piccolo. I'm still kind of reeling from your comment about making more money playing the piccolo.
Yeah, I flogged it. I flogged it a few years ago. Hard times.
Yeah. Being a saxophonist, I guess you could say and a classical saxophonist, I guess you could say you're a bit of an outsider to the classical world. And as a composer, I kind of feel the same. And we will often have conversations where we kind of fall down these rabbit holes of being really furious with the sort of current climate in the classical music world. You mentioned you specifically disliked competitions, and it's something I feel the same about, but they're kind of so intrinsically part of the classical world. I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, when like growing up, I did enjoy competitions, and they seemed really glamorous. And even that was just like as a I don't know, teenager. But then even at music college, I went to this one competition in Germany, not like a massive one, but it was all wind instruments with a specific saxophone section, and it was the really like positive experience because when you have to be brave, and I don't know, second year, and so you sort of take yourself off and you can't really afford it, but you go anyway, and you're all on your own in Germany. I can't really speak German, and then Yeah, and then hearing different players was really, really positive and effective. I just think sometimes well, it's that Bartok saying, isn't it? Sometimes competitions are just, it's not about the music anymore. And I don't know, judging music is a funny thing, isn't it? Because you can't please everyone. It's normally hard just to please yourself. So that's how I feel about that. But I really like that you use the word outsider, because I do think there's an element that maybe saxophonists bring it on ourselves. We're sort of a bit down dog about it. But, you turn up to do an orchestral thing and you're just the outsider, always. I do think that's true, yeah. And I think we maybe make it worse for ourselves as saxophonists, because I think people love the instrument. Real people like muggles that don't spend their lives playing musical instruments. They like, oh, I love the saxophone. So I don't think it's an issue with the general public. So that's my thoughts.
I grew up playing the euphonium, and my mum always said she wished I'd played the saxophone, like Lisa Simpson or Bill Clinton.
There you go. You see. I played the euphonium for a spell. I learned trombone one Christmas. Me and my mother did. We learned to play Daisy Daisy as a duet. It's quite hilarious. Good instrument, trombone.
That's very curious. But I must ask then, why did you choose the saxophone?
Because I played recorder, and then I played flute, and then because I'm this cool, I played rock flute, and then I had a babysitter who liked stuff like Michael Jackson, and she played the saxophone, and she was like the coolest person ever. And so we'd swap instruments, and I realised how utterly cathartic the saxophone was. And I used to go out. I borrowed one from school, and I'd go outside and play before school in the morning. I bet my family loved that. Yeah. So the saxophone, because I thought it was cool.